Imagine this. You and your partner are expecting a baby girl. You're flipping through baby name books, scrolling through websites, trying to find the perfect name for your incoming bundle of flesh. And then your partner looks up at you with starry eyes and says, "Hey honey, what do you think about Regan?" And your heart jumps into your throat because the first thought that comes to your mind is this.
Your mother sucks and hell carrots, you faithless slime.
Understandably, you decide to name her Rebecca instead. But it turns out the image of a puking, head-spinning, possessed girl doing unspeakable things wasn't as much of a deterrent as you might think. In fact, Regan entered the list of the top 1,000 most popular girl names in America for the first time ever in 1974, the year after The Exorcist hit theaters. Instead of exorcising the name from the minds of expectant parents, the movie seemed to make the name more popular. Which begs the question, do famous horror movie villains scare parents away from certain baby names, or do they swing the pendulum the other way, actually inspiring some naming trends? I compiled all the data from the US Social Security records and popular baby name databases, and the answer is a little more complicated than one or the other. But the results are interesting. To find out which names became household staples and which were too creepy even for horror fans, stick around to the end of this video. A few ground rules before we start. I'm only covering names that were already in use before horror icons adopted them, so I can see how the Hollywood spotlight changed the trajectory. Sorry to anyone out there named Orlok, Babadook, or Pyramid Head. If I ever make a video about exotic horror villain names, I'll be sure to consider you guys. I also tried to stick to names that are primarily associated with a horror character. Yes, Zelda Goldman creeped out readers in Stephen King's novel Pet Sematary in 1983, 3 years before Princess Zelda was captured by the evil forces of Ganon in The Legend of Zelda, but neither the horror classic or the NES classic managed to propel the name back into the top 1,000, like when the name dominated in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. This is when the novelist Zelda Fitzgerald, wife of Great Gatsby author F. Scott Fitzgerald, was born. The name Zelda wasn't actually popular enough to resurface in the data from the fall off in 1967 all the way until 2015, which was the year that The Legend of Zelda Triforce Heroes came out. This is the only Legend of Zelda game that Princess Zelda is not in or mentioned in. Guys, what is going on? After thinking about it, it's probably just the year that the kids who grew up on Stephen King and Nintendo games were old enough to have kids of their own, but it's still pretty funny. As far as the data is concerned, we're primarily using official records from the US Social Security Administration. Popular sites like BabyCenter.com and Parenting Patch largely mirror the same numbers. I don't want to start seeing ads for diapers, and the SSA database is probably the most reliable long-term record we have. Perfect for tracking whether horror movies leave real fingerprints on the birth certificates of horror fans in the making. The idea for this video came to me while researching a horror history episode on another infamous horror name, Sadako Yamamura, from the Japanese horror Ringu. The name can be translated to either child of chaste or child of sand, which both fit nicely with her backstory, given that her kind reproduces without intercourse and given that she was born on an island. What I found with Sadako is that the name, which used to be more common in Japanese, had already been in decline before Ringu was released, because the Japanese suffix ko, meaning child, was kind of becoming old-fashioned at that point. So Sadako, her mother Shizuko, and her J-horror rival Kayako did not help stop the decline. The census data never really goes back further than about 200 years, so if you were hoping to check the name popularity impact of anyone older than Jack the Ripper, you probably need a time machine, and like an army of census takers. As for Jack himself, the English data would probably make more sense, given that Jack the Ripper terrorized London, not America, but the data isn't as well kept. But as for the US, the data isn't the best, but it looks like the name only grew in popularity after Jack the Ripper's crimes in 1888. In the 1920s, the name was so popular that about 1 in 100 males were named Jack, and it even scratched the bottom of the chart as a female name. Statistically, some of you probably have a great-grandma named Jack. It's hard to say with any certainty that Jack the Ripper was really a catalyst for any naming trends though, since the name was already in the top 100 in popularity in the decade leading up to his emergence. And the same is true for a lot of horror villains. Most of these characters don't use very obscure names. In fact, most use names that were already extremely common amongst normies before their murderous alter egos hit the screen. Maybe the creators of these stories wanted to keep things generic, to give off the idea that the scary story you're taking in could just as easily happen to you. So the best place to start is somewhere in between, on a stretch of California highway where a lonely little roadside motel houses a very disturbed young man named Norman Bates. Most early cinema horror villains weren't really on a first-name basis with the general public, and the ones that were tended to be known by their monster names. How often do you hear the Wolfman referred to as Larry Talbot, or the Invisible Man referred to as Dr. Jack Griffin? As much as I'd love to meet someone named Gilman or Count Dracula, those aren't the kinds of names that you're likely to find on a baby registry. Well, I guess Gil is, but probably Gilbert, not Gilman. But in 1960, Alfred Hitchcock flipped the script by introducing much of the world to a new flavor of horror, a villain with a perfectly ordinary name. Norman Bates, the proprietor of the Bates Motel at the center of Hitchcock's smash hit, Psycho. Norman Bates is just supposed to be a normal guy who used his motel to bait innocent victims. It's gotta be one of the earliest and most famous examples of an ordinary name that became permanently linked with bodily mayhem, the most iconic prototype to the modern slasher. You might assume that watching Janet Leigh get carved up like that would have instantly wiped the name Norman from the baby books, but the data tells a different story. When Psycho first premiered in 1960, Norman was already falling out of fashion. It peaked in the early 1930s, reaching number 37 on the top 1,000 list in both 1932 and 1933, part of the silent generation that would come of age in the shadow of the Great Depression and World War II. While still a popular name, Norman had slipped to number 132 by the time this infamous shower scene was scaring people out of basic hygiene.
Well, I had a letter from a man who said that my daughter, after she saw the French film Diabolique, would never take a tub anymore because they had a scene with a man coming out of a tub and taking his eyes out. Some horror scene. Now, having seen Psycho, she won't take a shower. As a result, she's very unpleasant to be around.
Diabolique is one of the best movies ever, by the way. I guess most people old enough to buy a movie ticket in 1960 had already been too hardened by real-world terrors like poverty, global war, and the specter of nuclear annihilation to be all that concerned about the implications of the name Norman. In a twist I didn't see coming, Psycho did not accelerate Norman's decline in any meaningful way. If anything, the decline actually slowed for a couple years before continuing on the downward course it was already on. It seems like simple boredom likely played a bigger role in this generic name's steady decline, and then it just became one of those old-fashioned names. Like right now, you know how if I say Gertrude or Mildred or Ernest, you're probably picturing an old person? That's kinda what Norman was going through at the time. Same for the female derivative, Norma, which hovered in the 160 to 170 range during that same period. Basically, Hitchcock gave the world one of the most disturbing villains in cinema history, and the expectant parents of the world just shrugged. But what if we look at a name that didn't already have a place on the pages of popular baby name books? It was not the power of Christ that compelled this next group of parents to name their child after a possessed girl. It was the power of cinema.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
The Exorcist takes us along for the story of a 12-year-old girl named Regan MacNeil. Unlike Norman, Regan wasn't a common name at all before The Exorcist sent audiences into a pea soup-colored frenzy when it debuted in 1973.
We have a lot of people throwing up and a lot of people shuddering, but the thing that really surprises me is people faint. I mean, I've never in my life known a movie where people would faint. I mean, it's hard to make people faint.
Regan, a name speculated to descend from an Irish word meaning little queen or little king for boys, didn't even crack the top 1,000 baby names in the US. But in 1974, the year after audiences first watched a young Linda Blair levitate, swear like a sailor, and redecorate her bedroom walls with projectile vomit, the name Regan suddenly appeared on the charts for the first time ever, ranked number 241. It climbed again in 1975 to number 236 before finally dropping off the list entirely in 2013. The 2000 re-release of The Exorcist, marketed as the version you've never seen with 12 minutes of extra footage not present in the original release, likely helped keep the name circulating for a few extra years before it went the way of its infamous foul-mouthed demon and finally disappeared. 2000 was actually the biggest year for Regan overall. Another possible factor in extending Regan's shelf life was the American Film Institute's 100 Years, 100 Thrills list, which ranked The Exorcist as the third most thrilling film of all time back in 2001. I know it's hard to imagine such a list having a major cultural impact, but we're not talking about your everyday Watch Mojo ranking. This was a major TV special on CBS hosted by Harrison Ford, something that held real weight and cinephiles actually looked forward to. But fandom is one thing. Actually naming your daughter after a demon-possessed little girl was a much bigger step. But there may have been a couple things that helped smooth over the reputation of the name. The spelling occupied a rare middle ground. It was unusual without being unfamiliar, thanks to Hollywood actor turned politician Ronald Reagan, who was the governor of California when The Exorcist had its blockbuster debut. The future president's surname was already well known in America in the 1970s, despite being before his two-term White House run in the 1980s. So there was a familiarity bias already baked in before Regan the girl's head ever started spinning. Another important factor to consider is that I might have cheated in the thumbnail of this video, because in The Exorcist, Regan isn't actually a villain. She's just a little girl who played with the Ouija board and got possessed by Pazuzu, who invades and corrupts her body. No one hears the name Regan and immediately thinks demon. They think of the girl terrorized by demon. Sadly, the name Pazuzu still isn't popular enough to make a blip on the Social Security census data, and will not for another 1,000 years.
Pazuzu, you ungrateful gargoyle!
And that victim-villain distinction really matters. Unlike, say, Freddy Krueger or Hannibal the Cannibal Lecter, characters that actively perpetrate evil against other characters in their respective films, the average audience can identify with Regan. And considering she comes out stronger than when she started by the time credits roll, her name becomes synonymous with endurance and survival. Finally, there's the strongest and simplest explanation. Popularity breeds more popularity. Editor, put the nerd emoji on my face while I say this next part. Massive films that reach global appeal create what sociologists call cultural diffusion. Even people who never saw The Exorcist still heard the name in conversation, advertising, news coverage, and late-night talk shows. Over time, the name sort of bolts itself onto the cultural consciousness.
Hello, Linda. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
How's the head, all right?
Oh, yeah.
No horns?
No horns.
And plus, it's just a cool name. Instant credibility points when the teacher calls it out during attendance on the first day of school. Pazuzu could never. And he's probably playing games on that laptop instead of doing his schoolwork. It's all fun and games until your parents are sent a screenshot of FNAF 2, kid. All that said, Regan still represents a very specific kind of naming phenomenon, a rare name that suddenly surges in popularity after hitting the cultural zeitgeist. But our next entry flips that idea on its head, borrowing a name that was already wildly popular and reinventing it as a horror shorthand for the most violent prom night ever put on film. Carrie White, the tormented telekinetic high schooler at the center of Stephen King's debut novel, mesmerized readers when it first hit bookshelves in 1974. Brian De Palma's film adaptation followed 2 years later in 1976, and the timing couldn't have been better for expectant parents with pig-blooded revenge on the brain. In terms of popularity, the name Carrie was on a historic upswing throughout the 1970s. It was the 42nd most popular name in 1974 when the book came out, then reached its all-time peak in 1976, the same year as the film's release, with 7,992 babies named Carrie, good enough for the number 28 spot in the United States. In 1977, the year after the film's theatrical release, Carrie maintained its rank at number 28 before gradually declining in later decades. It remained in the top 100 until 1986, then fell off the list entirely in 2007, which means scores of girls grew up sharing a name with the telekinetic teenager who famously turned prom night into a bloodbath. The movie didn't derail the name's popularity, but I'd say it simply coexisted alongside a naming trend that was already in full swing. You could say King titled his book around a popular name at the time, but it's hard to say how much it contributed to it. But what I can say is that the popularity of Carrie seems to have taken away from the growth of the formal version, Caroline, which only rebounded when the shorthand Carrie finally fell off. By the way, since I know you're going to ask, the film version of Coraline came out in 2009, and by 2012 it had surged to the 826th most popular girl name. Get ready to see an army of Coralines entering the workforce in 2030. CZsWorld Try Not to Mention Coraline Challenge failed once again. Back to Carrie though, the 2013 Carrie remake, starring Chloe Grace Moretz, tried to reassert the name's former stranglehold on the public consciousness, but the name didn't take off again, probably more proof that King's novel rode the Carrie wave rather than creating it. Still, that hasn't stopped countless homages to Carrie across film and television from trying to resurrect the name of everyone's favorite supernatural high school reject. Maybe the new Carrie TV series will help stamp a few extra Carries on the birth certificates of baby girls born in 2026, but I have a feeling that the drought the name is currently experiencing will carry on. But next, I want to look at another movie that was released in 1976, one that might have a greater effect on baby naming traditions because in this one, the evil is an actual baby, and things get out of hand 5 short years later. Damien Thorn, the embodiment of evil with the numbers 666 burned into his head. You might assume that naming your child after the literal son of Satan would be a hard sell, but according to the data, not really. Following the release of The Omen in 1976, the name Damien saw a decent bump in the late 1970s before basically returning to where it started. Damien was number 284 of the top 1,000 baby names for boys in 1976 when the film debuted, and the name peaked at number 161, staying comfortably within the top 1,000 boy names to this day. Seeing this spike happen right after the movie seems like pretty convincing evidence that The Omen is what thrust the name Damien into the limelight, but I will note that the all-time highest concentration of Damiens came in 2007, amidst a very strong decade for the name. There was a remake of The Omen in 2006, but Damien was already on the up and up a few years before that. To understand this one, we've got to look at the meaning behind the name in the first place. Oftentimes in these religious horror movies, we see the demonic entity trying to mock religious institutions. For example, Toby from Paranormal Activity mocks the Book of Tobit, and the strange knocks in The Conjuring come in threes to mock the Holy Trinity. Damien Thorn is no exception. According to the baby registry site The Bump, the name Damien is particularly popular throughout Christian communities in Europe, most likely because of the martyred Saint Damien. If you'd like a name imbued with strength and stability, Damien is a solid choice. So the name has always had religious connotations. And you know what kind of names were absolutely exploding in the 2000s decade? Names with biblical connections. We're talking Levi, Isaiah, Gabriel, Elijah. Even classics like Jacob, Matthew, Michael, and Joshua took the top spots in 2001. Of the 10 most popular boys' names, 8 shared biblical namesakes. It's likely that the second wave of Damien was more motivated by the religious naming trend than anything else, but unlike some of the others, it still hangs around today. As of 2024, it ranked number 344, with its variant, spelled with an A instead of an E, doing even better at number 110. What a difference a letter makes. Statistically speaking, there are probably thousands of perfectly nice and normal Damiens walking around right now who are not destined to usher in the apocalypse. But none of them are watching this video. All the Damiens watching this video are evil, unless they leave a like and subscribe. And if your name is not Damien, then a Damien will kill you if you don't subscribe. Am I even allowed to say that? But as the 1970s bled into the 1980s, the genre made a hard pivot away from traumatized teens and cursed children, and proved that you don't need an exotic name to create iconic horror villains. Enter the era of the slashers. These next 3 cinematic monsters are often referred to as the Big Three, but in reality, they all have pretty standard, not all that intimidating names. Of course, I am referring to Michael, Jason, and Freddy. Let's start with the original Halloween and its silent killer with the white mask, Michael Myers. When John Carpenter's instant classic debuted in 1978, the name Michael was already the #1 boy's name in America, enjoying the top spot for nearly 2 decades running. Once again, religion plays a part. The Archangel Michael, the one credited with defeating Satan and casting him out of heaven in the Christian Bible, likely had something to do with the name's popularity in the predominantly Christian United States. Michael Jackson was also on the come up in the 70s, having released his first solo album in 1972. So yeah, the name couldn't have been more popular when the movie came out. Practically 1 in every 25 boys were named Michael that year. But Halloween was one of the most profitable independent films of all time, and it really scared people who came out to the cinema back then. Chances are, some of those screaming theater patrons became parents, especially because the average first-time parent was 22 years old at the time. But do you think new parents shied away from the name now associated with a creepy babysitter-obsessed stalker? Not even close. In 1978 alone, more than 67,000 baby boys in the United States were named Michael, and more than 3,600 of those came from Illinois alone, which is the slasher's canonical home state. It didn't change as the teens raised on Halloween got older either. Michael held the top spot through much of the 1980s and early 1990s, eventually settling at number 18 as of 2024. While it may look like Michael has been in decline since '69, which is technically true, the release of Halloween doesn't alter that trajectory, and it's still much more popular than other names. Like, if I added Damien to this graph, the line is barely noticeable. But Michael wasn't the only slasher whose name was already a mainstay within maternity wards, because Jason Voorhees, the summer camp counselor's worst nightmare, was the 3rd most popular boy's name in America when the original Friday the 13th debuted in 1980. I already analyzed if Jason had anything to do with the old-fashioned hockey mask going out of style when I made my Jason Voorhees horror history episode, but could the same be said about his name? Although it dropped out of the top 5 by 1983, the name stayed in the top 100 until 2019. Ironically, Jason wasn't even the killer in the original film.
Then you should know Jason's mother, Mrs. Voorhees, was the original killer. Jason didn't show up until the sequel.
This is basically the same case as Michael and Sadako, where the name was already in decline by the time the movie came out, leading me to the conclusion that there's no correlation. My initial thought was that a popular name like Jason was used because the generic names of Michael and Billy from Halloween and Black Christmas worked so well. But Victor Miller, the screenwriter who cooked up the original Friday the 13th, said he named Jason after his two sons, a portmanteau of Josh and Ian. So in my mind, the name should actually be Joshian, not Jason, but whatever. I mean, it's a nice gesture. I would be honored to be named after a fictional serial killer. But I feel like normal people might be put off by it. Like if he discovered a star or planet and named it after his kids, that's a nice gesture. But Jason is the guy known for stuffing naked teenagers into a sleeping bag and slamming them against a tree until they die. You know what though? It's an honor. It's an absolute honor. As for Pamela Voorhees, Jason's homicidal mother, Miller says her creation does line up with my initial thought. He wanted to make the killer a woman to contrast with Halloween, since he was aware that he was already taking a lot from that movie.
Here I created my fantasy mom, that if I had been bullied or mistreated by anybody, she would have killed them. I realize that's extreme, but so is horror. And so I got to have the mother to kill all mothers, and it's wonderful.
And while we're on the topic, the name Pamela was hugely popular in the 50s, had a huge fall, and actually started to recover a little bit before the movie dropped in 1980, rose a tiny bit in 1981, then fell ever since. If it had immediately started dropping again the year after the movie came out, I'd be more inclined to suspect that Pamela Voorhees killed the Pamela naming renaissance, but in reality, I think the only thing she killed was those camp counselors. But that's the thing. Even if the data doesn't spell out a naming trend being influenced by horror, you absolutely know that there was at least one pregnant couple who kind of liked the name Pamela, saw that movie, and then immediately went back to the drawing board. The final name in the unholy trinity of slasher gashers is the burn-faced nightmare killer, Freddy Krueger. The main villain of 9 movies and the host of a short-lived TV series, Freddy differs from his peers in that his name was never a massive mainstream favorite to begin with.
It's not my fault this is dead on her feet.
In 1984, the year A Nightmare on Elm Street debuted, there were 234 babies named Freddy in the United States. By 1989, that number had climbed to 359 births, a slight increase good enough for the 503rd most popular American boy's name. But Freddy would never chart that high again, dropping to number 996 in 2015 before falling out of the top 1,000 entirely, slightly lower than its rank of 948 when Freddy first cracked the top 1,000 nearly a century prior in 1925. But here's the thing. Freddy is more of a nickname. The proper version of this name is Frederick, which is also Freddy's real name, but it barely gets used, because Anthony Rizzo does not appear in the Elm Street franchise.
Frederick!
I know I've used that clip before, but it's a great clip, okay? There's also the more traditional Fred, which lasted a little longer on the chart, debuting insanely high at number 17 back in 1900 before bowing out of the top 1,000 in 2023. Freddy was on the chart for almost 100 years though, which is surprising to me. And honestly, the name does kind of catch on more once the Elm Street movies started coming out. It's not a crazy spike, but I'm willing to imagine Wes Craven's original Nightmare Man had something to do with it. Think about it. There's a big difference between Freddy and his slasher-era counterparts. Freddy talks, he's charismatic, he has admirers who love his personality, not just his brutality. He makes jokes, he can be corny, he can be cool. In New Nightmare, he's even a celebrity. So I could see people being more likely to name their kid after Freddy, who has all of these human qualities, as opposed to Michael, who is literally known for his incongruent affect, his ability not to show human emotion while doing these horrible things that typically draw emotional reactions. Same goes for Jason. This kind of seems to be the key to understanding this whole thing. Norman, weird antisocial mama boy's freak, did not inspire namesakes. Regan, relatable family girl who got sick. We've all been sick, right? Except for Bruce Willis in Unbreakable, but you get the idea. But as you probably know, Freddy Krueger isn't the only iconic horror villain named Freddy, because after all, you've only got Freddy's initial run in the top 1,000 ended in 2012, but there was one more blip in 2015, when the name barely squeezed in at a number 996 ranking. This was 1 year after Five Nights at Freddy's 1 and 2, and it was the same year as FNAF 3 and 4, basically the peak of FNAF mania. That has to be a correlation, right? But Freddy never charted again, and I think it goes back to what I just said. FNAF was incredibly popular, but Freddy Fazbear is just an animatronic robot who will never have the personality that Mr. Krueger has. I mean, if we want to get technical about it, the name of the boy who possessed Freddy was actually Gabriel, but I already showed the Gabriel chart earlier, so I'm not doing it again. I also looked up other variations like Nightmare Freddy, Toy Freddy, and Glamrock Freddy. Doesn't seem like anyone named their kid those. So if you're currently pregnant, those are up for the taking. Please let me meet a kid named Golden Freddy in the future. It would be so fucking funny. Or Funtime Freddy. I do love how if you type Fazbear into this website though, it actually recognizes it as a surname. But I did look up more names in the slasher genre, and it's basically the same story, with famous fictional killers like Charles Lee Ray from Child's Play not doing anything interesting for the names Chucky or Charles, and Billy Loomis and Stu Macher from Scream having little to no effect on real-world naming patterns despite their popularity. Again, those are both nicknames, but William and Stuart didn't do anything either. Staying on the 90s, Hannibal was never popular enough to chart, so I moved on to the 2000s. The name Ginger actually had some popularity, but died a good 10 years before Ginger Snaps came out in 2000. Being me, I wanted to do a Saw one, but as I mentioned, Billy didn't have any interesting takeaways, and John has just been in decline seemingly forever, and Jigsaw, unfortunately, did not yield any baby name results. The most interesting results to this point have been unconventional names that are close enough to normal names to pass the eye test, so I wanted to brainstorm some more of those. And suddenly, while watching a screening of a new horror movie, I realized the answer was right in front of me, and it would bring this whole investigation full circle, or full ring, if you will.
And one winter they went away. When they came back, it was with Samara. Adopted, they said. Never did say from where.
In the Japanese film Ringu, the psychic-powered well-dweller is a girl named Sadako Yamamura. And while the name was once popular in Japan, it obviously never charted here in the old US of A. Which is actually too bad, because I think it's a cool sounding name. It sounds Japanese, but not too Japanese. Not too hard to pronounce. I guess I could see the local PE coach calling it Sadako or something, but hopefully the other kids would be smart enough not to bully someone named Sadako. Despite that, when the American remake, The Ring, arrived in 2002, the character was renamed to Samara Morgan. And suddenly, much like the psychically disturbed girl that crawls through your television set, the name began showing up in unlikely places. Before the movie's release, Samara was virtually non-existent in the United States. In 2002, the number of girls born with that name jumped to 656. In 2003, it climbed again to 857 births. The uptick continued for more than a decade, peaking in 2018 with more than 1,200 births just that year. That's a massive increase for a name that had once been practically unheard of, likely helped along by two relatively successful sequels, The Ring 2 in 2005 and Rings in 2017. It's likely that Samara got a second boost from the horror genre in the form of actress Samara Weaving, who appeared in Ash vs. the Evil Dead in 2015 and broke out with her role in The Babysitter in 2017, right before the name Samara peaked in 2018. Whether or not parents are naming their kids after celebrities is irrelevant. I mean, it's concerning if they are because it's a sign of celebrity worship getting out of hand, but that might be a topic for a different video, probably by a different YouTuber. But what I'm trying to say is that regardless of if it was fandom or just thinking the name sounds cool, a celebrity with a unique name can and will popularize that name. We saw it in the 2000s with Rihanna, we're seeing it right now with Zendaya. There's no doubt Samara also played a role. But even before Miss Weaving's breakout, The Ring was probably the most clear-cut example of a horror villain definitely inspiring a trend in the world of baby names. And again, it had nothing to do with people getting spooked out of a name, and everything to do with a cool, unique name coming into the zeitgeist because of the exposure of the Hollywood stage. It's almost like horror movies are a fun entertainment thing that brings people together and not an actual evil, harmful influence. When will the social media platforms learn this? But before we wrap up, there's one more era that I have to look at, which may be the key to understanding the relationship between horror names and real names going forward, and that is modern horror. The possessed doll in Pigtails and Porcelain enjoyed a sizable boost when James Wan opened the first Conjuring film with a chilling Annabelle-centered prologue. The name was already trending upward before The Conjuring's debut, cracking the top 100 for the first time ever in 2012. But 2013's Conjuring and the 2014 Annabelle spin-off that followed supercharged that momentum. In 2014, the year after the character's debut, 4,324 baby girls shared the name, good for a nationwide rank of 57. One of the most dramatic examples we've seen. But it seems like many parents had buyer's remorse, because just a year later, in 2015, Annabelle's popularity did a swift faceplant. It ranked 92 that year, then dropped to 104 in 2016, steadily dipping until it landed at 394 in 2024, which suggests more than a few parents to be eventually sat down, watched the movie, and said, you know what, maybe we go with Annalise, or Anastasia, or Annabeth, or just Anna. Why are there so many Anna names? Like we saw with Samara Morgan and Regan MacNeil, horror villains can occasionally give a modest popularity bump to their real-world namesakes, but the effect has its limits. Take the latest modern-day villain to mime his way into the slasher pantheon, Art the Clown. The name Art itself hasn't appeared in the top 1,000 baby names since 1967. 6767. But the longer, more formal version, Arthur, has always held much deeper cultural roots. The name has appeared on the Social Security Administration chart every year since the records began in 1900. In 2016, the same year that Terrifier premiered, Arthur ranked number 273 among baby boy names in the United States. Ever since, as the Terrifier films have carved out a healthy cult following, the name has steadily climbed the charts, reaching number 105 by 2024. But to be clear, that minor resurgence probably doesn't have anything to do with the homicidal clown that the film follows. Terrifier was not a phenomenon right off the bat. I'm pretty sure the film only had one screening in 2016, the premiere at the Telluride Horror Show Film Festival that October. The movie didn't actually gain any popularity until it appeared on Netflix in 2018, which you already know if you saw my video on how Art the Clown became a horror icon. It just goes to show that correlation is not always causation. Classic names cycle back into fashion all the time, and Art just happened to be in a movie the same year that the name made a comeback. But the popularity of this budding franchise could have kept Art's name lingering in the minds of horror fans and Miles County residents. It makes sense that horror villains don't deter people from giving their kids certain names. You don't see real-world villains making names taboo very often. In fact, there's only one kind of villain that will get people to stop using that name, and it's a pretty reliable way to kill a name, to be honest. I've heard Adolf, once a common name in Germany and Europe, took a nosedive after World War II, and the data seems to back that up. Babies named Osama fell sharply after 2001. ISIS had a brief stint in the rankings, but took a quick exit after 2014. Too bad, it's kind of a pretty name. My point is, it seems like you have to do some seriously messed up stuff to get your name blacklisted. Unless your name is Monica Lewinsky. Her name took a pretty dramatic decline after her affair with the president in the late 90s. For some reason, William and Bill did not see the same fall off. Guys, don't be sexist now. Let's make sure to shit on each of the genders equally here. At the end of the day, horror movies are just movies. It's not that serious. Parents tend to have no problem separating fiction from reality. Millions of people have happily named their children Michael or Annabelle, despite those names being shared with a mass serial killer or a demon-infested doll. When parents are considering a name, horror movies tend to rank pretty low on the list of priorities. They're usually thinking more about family traditions, cultural and religious influences, or simply what sounds right. Pop culture can play a role. Obviously, movies, TV, mega-famous celebrities, and historical figures all shape naming trends to some extent, but it's rarely the deciding factor that determines whether a person is born Leatherface or Lionel. But we've also learned, if it already feels usable or exotic, exposure can help normalize it. If it feels too strange or too tightly bound to a particular villain, the effect is minimal. In other words, horror movies don't ever really seem to curse a name that they're associated with. And again, we're not really sure about Hannibal because there's not enough data, but let me know if you know anyone named Hannibal in the comments, please. And let me know what you think will happen with the name Gladys over the next year. I kind of wonder how the numbers might differ if you already have the last name though. Like if your last name is Voorhees, are you really still gonna name your kid Jason? I guess that would be a whole different type of investigation though, where I'd have to go seek out the people with these names and try to talk to them. But maybe I don't have to do that. Maybe I can ask the same question to a couple who I already know. I am referring to my mom and dad. Hi Mom. Hi Dad. And for those who didn't read the lower third at the beginning of this video, yes, I share a name with a main character from a popular 90s sitcom called Saved by the Bell, Zac Morris.
Now for finalist number 2, the Powerhouse Preppies welcome Zac Morris and Jesse Spano.
So the story goes that my mom actually saw the show for the first time in the hospital during labor. And it must have been in reruns because Saved by the Bell had already ended at that point, obviously. But my parents didn't name me right when I was born. They couldn't decide on a name, so they actually waited a week, despite people at the hospital constantly asking them what my name was going to be, and finally decided on Zachary. So the ink on my birth certificate is about a week younger than I am. So I asked if seeing the show influenced them at all in their choice, and they said not consciously, because they were barely aware of the show or the character. So it's not like they were fans and named me after him. So based on that, if you have a very unconventional last name like Voorhees, you're probably less likely to name your kid Jason. But if your family name is Myers or White or maybe even Bates, you're probably less worried about a horror genre namesake and more worried about finding a name that works for you and your partner. Now, if you'll excuse me, my search history is f***ed, and our big tech overlords probably think that I'm having a baby. or maybe like 50 babies. So right now I'm gonna go spend the next 3 hours Googling emergency contraception, coat hangers, and fetus-sized coffins to try to reset my algorithm. If you enjoyed this episode, I think you'll like that one on the left where I talk about how Art the Clown rose to popularity. But more importantly, if you love horror, make sure you subscribe to CZsWorld for new horror deep dives every week, ring the death bell, and then select all notifications so you don't miss an upload, and I will see you in the next one. Assuming we both survive.